The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the windows of Atlanta General Hospital as Sarah Williams adjusted her nurse's uniform. At 32 years old, she had spent the last 8 years working in the rehabilitation ward, helping patients recover from various injuries and conditions. Her dark skin glowed with health, and her kind brown eyes always had a way of making patients feel at ease. That Monday morning started like any other. Sarah checked her patient list and noticed a new name: James Cooper, age 35, admitted after a car accident that had injured his spine. As she walked down the quiet hallway, the sound of laughter caught her attention, an unusual sound at 7 a.m. in the rehab ward. Standing in the doorway of room 415, Sarah paused. A man in a wheelchair was telling jokes to the morning shift cleaner, his hands moving animatedly as he spoke. Despite being confined to the wheelchair, his energy filled the entire room. His short brown hair was neatly combed, and his green eyes sparkled with life. This was definitely not what Sarah had expected to see first thing in the morning. "Good morning, Mr. Cooper," Sarah said, stepping into the room. "I'm Sarah Williams, and I'll be your primary nurse during your stay with us." James turned his wheelchair to face her, and his warm smile made Sarah's heart skip a beat. "Please call me James," he said, extending his hand. "Mr. Cooper makes me sound like my father." As Sarah began her routine check of his vital signs, she noticed how James didn't let the awkwardness of his situation affect him. While many patients in his condition often showed signs of depression or anger, James maintained a positive attitude that was truly refreshing. "So, Nurse Sarah," he said while she checked his blood pressure, "what's the worst joke you've heard in this hospital?" Sarah couldn't help but laugh. "Oh, probably something about patients having no patience." "That's terrible," James grinned. "Let me teach you a better one." Over the next hour, as Sarah helped James with his morning routine and checked his medication, she learned more about him. Before the accident, he had been a high school physics teacher, known for making science fun for his students. The accident had happened 3 months ago when a drunk driver had hit his car, but James spoke about it without bitterness. "Life's too short to be angry," he explained while Sarah helped him prepare for his first physical therapy session. "Sure, I'm in this chair now, but I'm alive. I can still teach, still laugh, still make a difference. That's what matters." Sarah found herself drawn to his philosophical outlook. Most patients she had worked with took months to reach such acceptance, if they ever did. But here was James, turning his tragedy into an opportunity for growth. During his physical therapy session, Sarah watched as James worked with determination. Even when exercises proved challenging, he didn't give up. Sweat dripped down his face as he tried to strengthen his upper body, knowing it would be crucial for his independence. "You know what keeps me going?" he asked during a rest break, wiping his forehead with a towel. "The thought that every small victory is still a victory. Yesterday, I couldn't lift this weight 5 times. Today, I did it 6 times. That's progress." By the end of her shift, Sarah realized something had changed. In just one day, James Cooper had shifted her perspective on what it meant to face adversity. His wheelchair wasn't a prison, it was simply a new way of moving through life. His disability hadn't diminished his spirit. If anything, it had revealed his true strength. As she drove home that evening, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about James's smile and his positive attitude. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a story that would change both their lives forever. Over the next few weeks, Sarah found herself looking forward to her shifts more than ever before. James's room became her favorite stop during her rounds, and she often spent her lunch breaks sitting with him, sharing stories and laughing at his clever jokes. One afternoon, while helping James with his exercises, Sarah's colleague Mary pulled her aside in the hallway. "Sarah, honey, I need to talk to you," Mary whispered, glancing around to make sure no one could hear them. "Some of us have noticed you're spending a lot of time with Mr. Cooper." Sarah straightened her back and looked Mary in the eyes. "He's my patient, Mary. I'm doing my job." "We both know it's more than that," Mary said, placing a hand on Sarah's arm. "Look, I've been a nurse for 20 years. I've seen how you look at him. I just want you to think carefully about what you're getting into." That evening, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about Mary's words. She knew her colleague meant well, but something about the conversation bothered her. Yes, she enjoyed spending time with James. But wasn't that natural? He was kind, intelligent, and made her laugh more than anyone she'd ever met. The next day, during James's physical therapy session, Sarah watched as he pushed himself to do one more set of exercises, even though she could see how tired he was. His determination touched her heart in a way she hadn't expected. "You know," James said, catching his breath between sets, "my students used to call me the science wizard because I could make even the most boring physics concepts interesting." He demonstrated by explaining momentum using his wheelchair as an example, making Sarah laugh with his creative teaching style. But not everyone shared Sarah's growing feelings. When she mentioned James during Sunday dinner at her parents' house, her mother dropped her fork with a clatter. "A disabled man?" Her mother exclaimed. "Sarah, baby, you need to think about your future. Who's going to take care of who, and what about children?" "Mama, we're just friends," Sarah protested, even though her heart said otherwise. "And James isn't helpless. He's one of the strongest people I've ever met." Her father, usually quiet during family discussions, spoke up. "Sarah, we just want what's best for you. Life is already hard enough for a black woman in this world. Why make it harder?" Sarah pushed her chair back from the table. "Because some things are worth it, Daddy." Back at the hospital, Sarah noticed how other staff members whispered when she walked by. Some gave her pitying looks, while others avoided eye contact altogether. But none of this mattered when she saw how James's face lit up every time she entered his room. One day, while helping James practice using his wheelchair on different surfaces, he suddenly grabbed her hand. "Sarah, I need to say something," he said seriously. "I know people are talking. About you, about us. I've seen the looks, heard the whispers." Sarah's heart beat faster, but she stayed quiet, letting him continue. "If you want to request a different patient, I'll understand," James said softly. "The last thing I want is to cause problems for you." Sarah looked at their hands, his pale fingers intertwined with her dark ones. In that moment, everything became clear. "James Cooper," she said firmly, "don't you dare try to push me away. I'm exactly where I want to be." His answering smile was brighter than any she'd seen before. From that day forward, something shifted between them. They both knew their connection had grown into something more than just nurse and patient, more than just friends. Despite the challenges ahead, they had chosen to break down the barriers others tried to put between them, one day at a time. As James prepared for discharge from the hospital after 2 months of rehabilitation, both he and Sarah knew their feelings had grown far beyond the normal nurse-patient relationship. On his last day, James asked Sarah the question he'd been practicing for weeks. "Sarah, would you like to have dinner with me sometime?" His voice was steady, but his hands gripped his wheelchair's armrests tightly. Not as a patient and nurse, but as a date. Sarah's heart jumped with joy, but she kept her professional composure until her shift ended. Later that evening, she called James and said yes. For their first date, James chose a small Italian restaurant he had carefully researched for wheelchair accessibility. When Sarah arrived, she found him already waiting outside, wearing a crisp blue shirt that brought out his eyes. He had a single red rose in his lap. "You look beautiful," he said, handing her the flower. Sarah wore a simple yellow dress that complemented her dark skin perfectly, and her braids were tied up elegantly. Inside the restaurant, they talked for hours. James told stories about his most memorable teaching moments, like the time he turned a lesson about gravity into a watermelon dropping experiment that had his students cheering. Sarah shared her dreams of eventually opening a rehabilitation center that would help people from underprivileged communities. "You know what amazes me about you?" James said, watching Sarah's face animate as she talked about her plans. "You don't just see problems, you see solutions. You don't just care for patients, you help them believe in themselves." Their second date was at a local park. James had discovered they held outdoor movie nights with space for wheelchairs. They watched an old romantic comedy under the stars, sharing popcorn and laughing at the cheesy dialogue. When Sarah got cold, James offered her his jacket, and their hands found each other in the darkness. Not every moment was perfect. Sometimes they had to change their plans when places turned out to be less accessible than advertised. Some restaurants had ramps but bathrooms too narrow for a wheelchair. Some people stared when they went out together, not just because James was in a wheelchair, but because they were an interracial couple. But James and Sarah faced these challenges with humor and creativity. When one fancy restaurant turned out to be inaccessible, they had an impromptu picnic in the park instead. When rain ruined their plans for an outdoor concert, They had their own music festival in James's living room, playing his vinyl collection and dancing. Sarah in her chair beside James's wheelchair, both spinning and laughing. One evening, as they sat on James's apartment balcony watching the sunset, he voiced his deepest fear. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm being selfish," he said quietly. "You're young, beautiful, successful. You could have an easier life with someone else." Sarah turned to face him, her eyes serious. "James Cooper, let me tell you something. Love isn't about what's easy. It's about what's real. And what we have? This is the most real thing I've ever felt." James reached for her hand, and Sarah noticed he was trembling slightly. "I love you, Sarah Williams," he said softly. "Not because you helped me, not because you're beautiful, though you are. I love you because you make me want to be better every day. You make me feel like I can do anything." Sarah felt tears in her eyes as she squeezed his hand. "I love you too, James. Everything about you, your strength, your kindness, your terrible science jokes." They both laughed, and James pulled her closer for a gentle kiss. As the sun set over the city, they sat together in comfortable silence, knowing that they had found something rare and precious, a love that saw past all barriers and straight into the heart. 3 months into their relationship, Sarah and James faced their first big challenge. James had been invited to give a presentation at a national teachers' conference in Chicago. It would be their first time traveling together, and both were nervous about the challenges ahead. The problem started at the airport. Despite requesting wheelchair assistance in advance, they had to wait for almost an hour. Some passengers gave them annoyed looks as they took extra time boarding the plane. Sarah felt her anger rising, but James squeezed her hand and whispered, "Hey, at least we get to board first." In Chicago, the hotel they booked had promised an accessible room, but when they arrived, they discovered the accessible bathroom barely had enough space for James's wheelchair to turn around. The front desk clerk seemed more annoyed than helpful when they requested a different room. "I'm so sorry about all this," James said later that evening, after they'd finally settled into a more suitable room. Sarah could hear the frustration in his voice. "Don't you dare apologize," she replied firmly. "None of this is your fault. The world needs to do better." The next morning, while having breakfast at a nearby cafe, an elderly woman approached their table. Sarah prepared herself for another uncomfortable moment, but instead, the woman smiled warmly. "You two remind me of my late husband and me," she said. "Everyone said we wouldn't work, him being Chinese and me being white. But we had 40 beautiful years together." She patted James's shoulder before leaving. "Love knows no barriers, dears." That afternoon, before his presentation, James received a call from Sarah's father. Sarah was getting coffee when the call came, and she returned to find James looking serious. "Your father wanted to make sure I understand what I'm getting into," James explained. "He said loving you means being ready for the stares, the whispers, the judgment, not just because of my wheelchair, but because we're different races. He wanted to know if I'm strong enough for that." Sarah felt her heart sink. "What did you tell him?" James smiled and took her hand. "I told him that every day I wake up grateful that his daughter chose me. That yes, life might be harder sometimes, but having you by my side makes me stronger than I've ever been." That evening, after James's successful presentation, they decided to try a fancy restaurant downtown. The maitre d' looked uncomfortable when they arrived, saying they were fully booked, despite several empty tables being visible. Sarah was about to argue when James spoke up calmly. "I understand you might not be prepared to accommodate us," he said. "But I hope you'll think about making changes in the future. Everyone deserves to enjoy a nice meal out." As they left, Sarah was quiet. James could see she was fighting back tears of frustration. "You know what amazes me," he said softly. "How you feel everything so deeply. You fight for justice, not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been treated unfairly." They ended up finding a small family-owned Mexican restaurant, where the owner immediately moved chairs to make space for James's wheelchair and treated them like honored guests. Over enchiladas and margaritas, they talked about their future. "These past few days haven't been easy," Sarah admitted, "but they've made me more sure than ever that this is right, that we're right." James reached across the table and wiped a bit of salsa from her chin. "Life's not going to get easier," he said. "There will always be people who don't understand. Places that aren't accessible. Days when everything feels like a struggle." "I know," Sarah replied, "but we'll face it together." and maybe we can help make things better for others along the way. That night, as they looked out over the Chicago skyline from their hotel room, Sarah and James held each other close. They had faced reality, the good and the bad, and their love had only grown stronger. Sometimes the greatest victories weren't in avoiding challenges, but in facing them together. After 6 months of dating, James knew it was time. He had been planning this moment for weeks, working secretly with Sarah's best friend Lisa to make everything perfect. The ring, a beautiful sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, sat hidden in his apartment, waiting for the right moment. James chose Guardian Park for the proposal, the same park where they had their second date watching movies under the stars, but getting everything ready wasn't easy. He needed help setting up, and his friends Mike and David had volunteered to arrive early to string fairy lights in the trees and set up a small table with candles. The morning of the big day, James woke up feeling nervous. His hands shook slightly as he got dressed in his best navy suit. Everything had to be perfect. He had even asked Sarah's parents for their blessing 2 weeks ago, a conversation that had been both terrifying and touching. "I know I'm not what you imagined for your daughter," he had told them during that meeting. "But I promise to love her, support her dreams, and stand by her side, or well, roll by her side, for as long as she'll have me." Sarah's mother had cried, and her father had gripped James's hand firmly. "You make our daughter happy," her father had said. "That's all we ever wanted for her." Now, as the sun began to set, James waited nervously in the park. Lisa had told Sarah they were meeting for a girls' night out, but would bring her to the park instead. The fairy lights twinkled in the trees, and soft music played from hidden speakers. A path of rose petals led to where James waited. When Sarah arrived, she gasped. She wore a simple blue dress, her favorite color, and her hair was styled in elegant braids. As Lisa quietly slipped away, Sarah walked slowly down the petal-lined path, her eyes wide with wonder. "James," she whispered, taking in the romantic scene. "What is all this?" James moved his wheelchair forward to meet her, his heart pounding. "Sarah Williams," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "8 months ago, I was lying in a hospital bed, thinking my life was over. Then you walked in, and everything changed." He pulled out a small photo album he had prepared. Inside were pictures of their time together, their first date at the Italian restaurant, the outdoor movie night, their trip to Chicago, and many small moments in between. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she turned the pages. "You never saw my wheelchair as a barrier," James continued. "You saw me, just me. You fought for us when others doubted. You loved me not despite my challenges, but as a whole person." James moved to the last page of the album, where a small pocket held the ring. As Sarah opened it, he positioned his wheelchair to face her directly. "I might not be able to get down on one knee," he said with a small smile, "but my heart kneels before you every day. You are the strongest, most beautiful soul I've ever known. You make me want to be better, to love deeper." Taking the ring from the album with slightly trembling hands, James looked up into Sarah's tear-filled eyes. "Sarah Williams, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me, face all challenges with me, and let me love you for the rest of our days?" Sarah was crying openly now, but her smile lit up the entire park. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes. 1,000 times yes." As James slipped the ring onto her finger, their friends and family emerged from their hiding spots among the trees, cheering and clapping. Sarah's parents hugged them both, her mother wiping away tears. Lisa took pictures, capturing the joy on their faces. Later that night, as they celebrated with champagne and their loved ones, Sarah couldn't stop looking at her ring and at James. "You planned all this from your wheelchair?" she asked, amazed. James grinned. "Love finds a way," he said simply. "And I had some amazing helpers." Under the twinkling lights, surrounded by the people they loved most, Sarah and James shared a kiss that promised a lifetime of love, understanding, and partnership. Their journey hadn't been easy, and they knew there would be more challenges ahead. But together, they were ready to face anything. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear. Sarah stood in front of the mirror in the bridal suite of Eden Gardens, an accessible venue they had carefully chosen for their special day. Her wedding dress, a beautiful creation of white lace and silk, had been designed to look perfect whether she was standing or sitting beside James in his wheelchair during the ceremony. "You look like an angel," her mother said, adjusting Sarah's veil. The dress complemented her dark skin perfectly, and tiny crystals sparkled in her braided updo. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she held her bouquet of white and blue roses. In another room, James was getting ready with help from his best man, Mike. They had practiced for weeks to make sure James could manage his suit independently in his wheelchair. The navy blue suit was perfectly tailored, with special adjustments to prevent it from bunching up while he sat. Nervous? Mike asked, helping James with his bow tie. Not about marrying Sarah, James smiled. Just hoping everything goes smoothly with the wheelchair during the ceremony. We practiced so many times. The venue had been transformed into a beautiful blend of both their cultures. African fabrics were draped elegantly alongside traditional wedding decorations. The aisle was extra wide to accommodate James's wheelchair, and gentle ramps replaced all steps. Instead of traditional rows of seats, the chairs were arranged in a semicircle, ensuring everyone could see the ceremony clearly. As the music began to play, a beautiful mix of classical wedding songs and African beats, James took his place at the altar. His heart nearly stopped when the doors opened and Sarah appeared on her father's arm. Guests stood, many wiping away tears at the sight of the radiant bride. The path to the altar was lined with rose petals and fairy lights. Sarah's father, looking proud in his gray suit, guided her slowly down the aisle. When they reached James, Mr. Williams kissed his daughter's cheek, then placed her hand in James's, whispering, "Take care of each other." The minister, who had worked with them to create a ceremony that celebrated their unique love story, smiled at the couple. "Love knows no boundaries," she began. "Today, we celebrate two souls who proved that true love sees with the heart, not with the eyes." During their vows, both Sarah and James spoke from their hearts. James went first, his voice strong and clear. "Sarah, you saw me when others looked away. You loved me completely, not despite my wheelchair, but including it as part of who I am. I promise to love you just as completely, to support your dreams, and to remind you every day why you chose me." Sarah's voice shook with emotion as she spoke her vows. "James, you taught me that love isn't about what a person can or cannot do. It's about who they are in their heart. I promise to stand by you, to face all challenges with you, and to love you more deeply with each passing day." The ring exchange was particularly touching. They had chosen matching bands inscribed with the words, "Love finds a way," their motto since their first date. James had practiced for weeks to ensure he could slide the ring onto Sarah's finger smoothly from his wheelchair. After the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Sarah leaned down to kiss James, and the room erupted in cheers and applause. As they turned to face their guests, Sarah sitting gracefully on James's lap, their smiles could have lit up the whole city. The reception was a joyous celebration of their love. The venue's dance floor had been specially designed to be wheelchair-friendly, allowing James to dance with Sarah in his own way. They had choreographed a beautiful first dance that combined traditional moves with elegant wheelchair spins and turns. Later that evening, as they watched their guests enjoying themselves, Sarah squeezed James's hand. "Happy?" she asked softly. "More than I ever thought possible," he replied, looking at his bride with adoring eyes. "You know, people said we were crazy to think this could work." Sarah smiled, leaning down to kiss him again. "Maybe we are crazy, crazy in love." As the sun set on their perfect day, casting a golden glow over the celebration, Sarah and James knew that their wedding wasn't just a ceremony. It was a testament to the power of love to overcome any obstacle. 3 months after their wedding, Sarah noticed something different about James. He was spending more time at physical therapy sessions than usual, often coming home exhausted but with a mysterious smile on his face. When she asked about it, he would simply say he was trying to stay strong and healthy for their future. What Sarah didn't know was that James had been secretly meeting with Dr. Michael Chen, a leading researcher in spinal cord injuries. It had started 6 months before their wedding, when James read about an experimental treatment program that combined cutting-edge neural stimulation technology with intensive physical therapy. Every Tuesday and Thursday, while Sarah worked her hospital shifts, James would visit a private medical facility on the other side of town. There, Dr. Chen and his team had been working with him, using special electrodes to stimulate his damaged nerve pathways while he underwent rigorous physical exercises. The technology is still experimental, Dr. Chen had warned during their first meeting. "We can't promise anything, but there's a chance we might be able to restore some function to your legs." James hadn't told Sarah about the treatment, not wanting to raise her hopes unnecessarily. He remembered too well the pain in her eyes whenever they faced a new obstacle or limitation. If this didn't work, he didn't want her to experience that disappointment. The treatment was incredibly demanding. Some days, James would spend hours trying to move muscles that hadn't responded since his accident. The pain was often intense, leaving him drenched in sweat and trembling with exhaustion. But slowly, over months of persistent effort, small miracles began to happen. First, it was just a toe twitch, so slight that Dr. Chen had to verify it with specialized equipment. Then, gradually, James began to regain some sensation in his legs. The progress was painstakingly slow, but each tiny improvement felt like a massive victory to James and the medical team. One day, after a particularly challenging session, Dr. Chen pulled James aside with exciting news. The latest tests show significant improvement in nerve connectivity, he explained, showing James the scan results. We believe you might be ready for the next phase of treatment. The next phase involved a groundbreaking combination of stem cell therapy and the neural stimulation they've been using. It was expensive and risky, but James had already secretly sold his beloved car collection to fund it. The possibility of surprising Sarah with even a small improvement in his mobility was worth every penny and every moment of pain. Meanwhile, Sarah had her own secrets. She had noticed small changes in James's muscle tone during their intimate moments, but hadn't mentioned it, not wanting to pressure him. She also found a medical journal about spinal cord research in his study one day while cleaning, but had put it back without saying a word, understanding that James would share whatever he was doing when he was ready. The treatment continued to show promising results. With the help of specialized equipment, James was beginning to stand for short periods. The medical team was cautiously optimistic, though they reminded him that full walking ability might never return. But James didn't care about walking normally. Even the smallest improvement would be more than he ever dreamed possible. One evening, as James returned home from another secret session, he found Sarah sitting in their living room looking worried. "James," she said softly, "I know you've been keeping something from me. You're gone for hours, you come home exhausted, and sometimes I hear you crying in pain when you think I'm asleep." James wheeled closer to her, taking her hands in his. His palms were calloused from months of intense physical therapy. "Sarah, my love," he said, his voice trembling with emotion, "I haven't been completely honest with you. But in 2 days, at your birthday party, I promise I'll explain everything." Sarah looked into his eyes and saw not guilt or fear, but excitement and hope. She squeezed his hands and nodded, trusting that whatever secret he was keeping came from a place of love. Little did she know that her upcoming birthday would bring the biggest surprise of her life. Sarah's birthday party was set up beautifully in their backyard. Fairy lights hung from trees, just like the night James proposed, and close friends and family gathered to celebrate. Sarah wore a pretty red dress, her favorite color for special occasions, but she couldn't help feeling nervous about what James had promised to reveal. James seemed unusually quiet throughout the party, checking his phone often and exchanging mysterious looks with Dr. Chen, who had surprisingly been invited. Sarah had met the doctor briefly at the hospital before, but didn't know he and James had become friends. After the cake was cut and gifts were opened, James cleared his throat and asked for everyone's attention. The party guests gathered around as he wheeled to the center of the patio. "Sarah, my love," James began, his voice strong despite his obvious nervousness. "For the past 9 months, I've been keeping a secret from you. Not because I didn't trust you, but because I wanted to give you something special, something that seemed impossible." He gestured to Dr. Chen, who brought forward what looked like a specially designed walker with various supports and straps. Sarah's heart started beating faster as she began to understand what was happening. With Dr. Chen's help and some amazing new medical technology, James continued, "I've been working on a surprise. I can't promise miracles, and this isn't a complete recovery. But," he took a deep breath, "I want to stand with you, even if just for a moment." Tears filled Sarah's eyes as Dr. Chen and Mike, James' best friend, helped position the walker next to his wheelchair. The party guests watched in breathless silence as James carefully moved his legs, something Sarah had never seen him do before. Using the walker's supports and with Dr. Chen spotting him carefully, James slowly began to lift himself. Sarah gasped, her hands covering her mouth as her husband, her James, gradually rose to a standing position. Though the walker supported much of his weight, he was standing. "I'm still disability, James said softly, his voice shaking with effort. This doesn't change who I am or what we have. But now, just sometimes, I can stand beside you. Sarah walked toward him slowly, tears streaming down her face. As she got closer, James managed to lift one hand from the walker's support and reach for her. The moment their fingers touched, their friend Lisa quickly snapped a photo, capturing forever the look of pure love and joy on both their faces. How? Sarah whispered, holding his hand tight while Dr. Chen ensured he stayed stable. Why didn't you tell me? The treatment was experimental, James explained, his legs trembling slightly with the effort of standing. I didn't want to give you false hope, and, he smiled, I wanted to see your face in this moment. Sarah's parents watched from nearby, her mother crying happy tears while her father stood tall and proud. That's my son-in-law, he said to anyone who would listen, always finding a way to do the impossible. After a few precious minutes of standing, James carefully lowered himself back into his wheelchair, exhausted but happy. Sarah sat on his lap immediately, holding him close and crying tears of joy. This is just the beginning, Dr. Chen explained to the amazed party guests. With continued therapy, James might regain even more movement. It won't be a complete recovery, but every small victory is worth celebrating. Later that night, after the party ended and they were alone, Sarah and James looked at the photo Lisa had taken. In it, they were both glowing with happiness. James standing with support, Sarah looking up at him with pure love, their hands clasped together as if they'd never let go. You know, Sarah said softly, I fell in love with you exactly as you were. This doesn't change anything about how I feel. I know, James smiled, pulling her close. That's one of the million reasons I love you. But I wanted to show you, and everyone else, that love really does find a way. That nothing is impossible when two hearts believe in each other. The photo became their most treasured possession, displayed proudly in their living room. Not because it showed James standing, but because it captured the essence of their love story, a story about breaking barriers, defying expectations, and believing in the power of love to overcome any obstacle. Years later, people would still stop to look at that photo and ask about their story. And Sarah and James would smile, knowing that their journey had become an inspiration to others, proving that true love sees no limitations, it only sees possibilities.